this? Oh, this is the great dictator Charlie Chaplin's Globe Dance. I didn't know that was Wagner that was playing on that. Totally makes sense now why he chose Wagner for that, after all of the Hitler stuff going on in the last video. Oh my gosh. You know what, Roger? I think we should give Wagner another chance. Beethoven, sorry. Yeah, I think I kind of got a really one-sided view of Wagner from our last video on the story of music, so I'm gonna have to investigate him a little bit more. So I was looking back at my channel and I realized it's been 3 weeks since I released my last Story of Music video, although we took a break from the Story of Music a couple of weeks ago for the 1812 Overture. But we're back at it and we're going to be doing part 1 of episode 5 today, The Age of Rebellion. Have to admit that the last part of this series that we did was not really my favorite. You guys know that. I've said that multiple times in my previous 2 videos. However, I do think that the Story of Music is giving us a very cursory glance at music. I mean, it's still a good series, I'm still learning a lot, but I have to keep in mind that there's probably a lot more to these composers than what we're being shown in this series. For instance, Wagner's music. I was just kind of listening through some of his best pieces and realized that there's a lot more breadth to his music than just what we saw in the last episode. Speaking of the last episode, let's go back and take a look at some of your comments. If you don't want to sit through this, then that's fine. Hit the reaction chapter and go straight there and get right into the video for today. But first, it's that time. It's comment time. So our first comment today actually refers to Wagner. It is by F. Tomsk. He or she says that you certainly get that coming home feeling in Wagner, but he defers to the resolution of those unresolved chords over long stretches of time. Once you're used to the musical syntax, this makes the homecoming incredibly impactful, and Wagnerian musical climaxes are often hugely exhilarating because of this. Admittedly, I have not listened to hardly any of Wagner's, so it's probably true that if I took the time to listen to his full pieces of music, I might get that coming home feeling, which just means I like having music land somewhere. I don't like it being like this endlessly meandering, experimental type thing. I really like kind of that melody and kind of that chorus feeling, and then coming back and settling and repetition and being able to hear the real theme in the music, which again, I didn't really get that from Wagner in the last video because of just the really short clips that they played. So you were right, I have to listen to more of his music and I might enjoy him eventually. In the last video, I had a question about where Bohemia was, because I think it was Dvorak that was from Bohemia. He was here in the US working and then went back home to Bohemia. And of course, I'd heard of Bohemia quite often, but I had never really thought about where it actually was. And several of you commented on this one, but Flamethan says Bohemia is the biggest part of what is today the Czech Republic or Czechia, home of the capital of Prague. The other major part is Moravia, whose name is probably best known in the US through the Moravian Brethren religious denomination. Well, it's not known by me because I've actually never heard of that before. Gilbert and Sullivan came up in our last video because we were talking about opera and a lot of you were mentioning Gilbert and Sullivan, and they had kind of more of a lighthearted style, I guess, to their operas. Shane Nolan says, I remember in The Next Generation season 4, he's talking about Star Trek here, episode called Disaster, Jordy and Beverly seeing Gilbert and Sullivan, a modern major general. Yes, I do remember that. They were in the cargo bay and Beverly was putting on a play, I guess, well, not play, Gilbert and Sullivan's opera. She was putting on whatever opera Modern Major General is from, and she had to get Jordy to she was wanting him to sing for her, I guess as an audition or whatever. So he did a very out of tune rendition of it. I think probably to try and get out of the part. I'm glad you brought up TNG actually. Star Trek The Next Generation in particular is one of the shows that had a really huge impact on me as far as like learning things, because on that show, even though it's set in space, unbelievably they were always putting on like classical music concerts. They always had art, like the characters would be artists. They were always bringing up history and Shakespeare. So it had a really big impact on me as a kid growing up, and it kind of made me want to expand my universe and really gave me this desire to learn all of these things, because the characters on there seem to be these really well-rounded, educated people, and I wanted to be like that too. And I don't think that's ever left me, even into adulthood. I've always kind of been that way. Hence this channel. I think Star Trek also was very impactful for me as far as like being open-minded and seeking after the truth, because that is kind of like the underlying philosophy of Star Trek, is to seek out new life and new civilizations and embrace diversity and celebrate learning about differences and cultures and people. And you were seeing that all the time on Star Trek, of having to adapt to differences. And that's why I consider Star Trek like my favorite show ever, because it just went way beyond entertainment and actually had a real impact on my life. So for those of you who think Star Trek is just like this geeky science fiction show for, you know, nerds, it's actually way more than that. So maybe give it a shot if you haven't ever done that. In this last episode on the Age of Tragedy, there have been a ton of things pointing back to like just evil, horrible, dark stuff. We've had artwork, we've had music, just basically all of the arts have been like really themed in death and the macabre, that's how I say it. Marigano Phils says that the obsessions and interests of romantic art in general, apart from death and the macabre, such as Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, there is a new fascination at this time with medievalism and medieval romances, as well as Gothic architecture. Also a real interest in Shakespeare. The opera of the time and orchestral music is full of stuff based on Shakespeare, and also the political turbulence throughout Europe, as demands for greater democracy repressed by reactionary monarchies, the transformation of the Kingdom of Prussia into Germany and stuff. So I guess the 19th century in Europe especially, just, well, probably like all of the centuries previous to that too. I mean, it just seems like there was non-stop war and violence and changes happening in Europe. So yeah, so thanks for kind of shedding some light on kind of where people's thought processes were, or at least artists' thought processes were at this time. That does help me kind of understand this last episode, The Age of Tragedy, and kind of the direction everything was taking. Andy R says, I never knew that Dvorak music was about the New World. In the UK, it is associated with the olden days and was used in a famous bread advert for Hobbes. Well, I guess it's really interesting, right? How your perceptions of things can be different based on where you are located or what you were taught. I had no idea about this in the UK. You had no idea about Dvorak over here in the US and the New World. But I do want to actually see this bread advert. Andy R did include the link to the advert below his comment, so we're gonna go check it out right now. Definitely looks like the olden days.
Last stop on round to be old Ma Peggerty's place. 'Twas like taking bread to the top of the world. 'Twas a grand ride back though. I knew Baker'd have kettle on and slices of hot ovis ready. Get it inside you, boy, he'd say. You must have gone up that hill as fast as you came down.
Hovis, as good today as it's always.
Okay, well, we'll just cut it off with a please subscribe. Okay, so is it Hovis? Tasty wholemeal bread. As good today as it's always been. So I'm guessing this is a company that goes way back making bread, and so they're kind of like harkening back to their older days where they were delivering Hovis bread like this kid did. So I guess Dvorak did different kinds of music, because I don't know what piece that was from Dvorak. If you guys know what song of Dvorak's that was, let me know, because I would like to go back and listen to it in its entirety. I would say that it doesn't have that really distinct New World sound, that particular piece. Like, I was trying to like picture it with like a Western or like the American frontier, like that type of thing, which I could probably see it in that setting, but it's not like that super iconic, like a Western American sound. So it would definitely work like in a more European setting like this for sure. But I would like to listen to it in its entirety because maybe the rest of it has more of that New World sound. Our last comment is from Anthony Warner. He says, Pierce Morgan or an older Stephen Fry. Good to hear a little Debussy at the end. Surprised you didn't know about the Nazi adoration of Wagner. Well, if you hadn't really ever studied Wagner, you're not going to know about the Nazi part of it. I just never had heard of that before because I've never taken the time to really study this part of music before. Also, you are absolutely right. I did make a mistake. If you look at this picture right here, that definitely looks way more like Stephen Fry. That's who I meant, not Pierce Morgan. So, doesn't he look like Stephen Fry? Anyway, I'm not comparing Stephen Fry to Wagner. I'm just saying they look alike. Okay. Alright, so that's gonna do it for our comment time. Again, thank you so much for leaving those comments below. I did read through all of them, so if your comment didn't make it here, just know that I did read it and I did see it and I appreciate it. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's get into this next episode. A lot of you have told me down in the comments that we're coming up on like the best part of this series and that this next episode is your favorite. So I'm looking forward to see what the Age of Rebellion actually means. I'm assuming that it kind of goes 180 from the type of music that we've heard before. Although some of you have cautioned me that that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go back to kind of like the style of music that I personally prefer. So I have no idea what to expect. So let's see what I guess the second half of the 19th century has in store for us. I wonder if we're going to go into the 20th century. I have a feeling that we will. So let's have a look at the Age of Rebellion.
In the 31 years between the death of Richard Wagner in 1883 and the outbreak of the First World War, music was shaken by a series of rebellions. Russian music swept westwards exuberantly, as did the exotic sounds of distant continents. And symphonies and operas of astonishing intensity amazed and startled audiences. Modernism in music was born. The world was becoming a smaller place, with millions of poor European immigrants seeking refuge in the New World to join the white settlers, African Americans and Chinese workers already there. From this rich mix of musical cultures, soon to be heard on new-fangled record players and radios, would spring the blues, ragtime and jazz. In just over 3 decades, music underwent a series of gigantic convulsions. Change came in many different forms, some exciting, some bewildering. Revolution was in the air, and all of music's laws and traditions were about to be shaken to their roots. What happened was a series of musical rebellions. The first was aimed at displacing the musical giant of the late 19th century, Richard Wagner. His ideas, his style and his musical philosophy had been such a pervasive presence in classical music that what might have followed him was a plague of pseudo-Wagners. In fact, what followed in his wake was an explosion of musical activity that sought to do things very differently indeed. It may not always have been deliberate, but there was a kind of not Wagner renaissance. All the things he hated most came to life. The French, for a start.
Okay.
In France, a new wave of composers made it their business to write music of deliberate simplicity and clarity, and to banish pretension and earnestness of all kinds. The French were about to enjoy a musical golden age, thanks to their reaction against Wagner. Their best 50 years ever in music blossomed after he went off to his personal Valhalla, with Faure, Debussy and Ravel leading a glorious riposte to German musical dominance. The movement was set in train by one of the most remarkable figures in music, Erik Satie.
I've heard this a lot, but I had no idea who wrote it. Erik Satie, I've never heard of him.
Erik Satie's first Gymnopédie of 1888, as well as sounding like a long, hot afternoon after a boozy lunch, can be seen as the first shot in a war to debunk pomposity and declutter French music. Satie, described by his tutors at the Paris Conservatoire as the laziest student ever, was an eccentric intellectual who hung out with other arty dreamers in Montmartre.
I mean, the style of music kind of backs up that personality he just talked about.
Satie's music could hardly sound less like Wagner and what the Germans were up to. The irony is that there was a German influence on the work of Satie's Parisian contemporaries. Here's a clue. Composers like César Franck, Charles-Marie Widor, Camille Saint-Saëns and Gabriel Faure were all trained organists. And playing the organ means, above all, knowing one particular composer's work inside out.
Yeah.
J.S. Bach.
The fugues, right? Never
More
heard
than
of any of these
100
guys.
years after his death, these organist composers in France were invigorated and inspired by Bach's clarity and economy. Even the master himself might have admired Charles-Marie Widor's famous toccata. It was first performed by Widor himself at the Trocadero Palace in Paris in 1889, and it's given a rousing send-off to many a newly hitched bride and groom ever since.
Really? This is a wedding song? I don't think I've ever been to a wedding where they played this.
The dignity and dexterity of Bach can also be heard in the music of Gabriel Faure, perhaps the most talented of these French organist composers. Listening to Faure after Brahms, Liszt, Wagner or Tchaikovsky is as if someone has spring-cleaned and redecorated a teenage boy's bedroom. Gone are the posters of death, psychological torment, superheroes and tragedy. The augmented piles of clothes have been put away and the windows have been opened to dispel the diminished, sneaker-smelling air. Faure's exquisite music simply says chill, or perhaps refrigerez-vous.
I have a really quick question. Are these paintings that we're seeing right here contemporaries of these composers as well? Are they part of the same era, or are they matching paintings from a different era with this music, like they were kind of with all of the horrible, like, devilish paintings and stuff? Because if they match, if they go together at the same time period, I can definitely see this correlation between them.
The exquisite pieces of Satie, Saint-Saëns, Faure and the new wave of French composers were mostly small in scale. The next important step in the non-Wagner rebellion took place in the realm of symphonic music. And the composer who carried the torch for large-scale orchestral and vocal music after Wagner was about as different from him as a human being could be. Though he championed Wagner's operas as music director of the Vienna State Opera House, Wagner would have despised him because he was Jewish. He was Gustav Mahler.
Why have I not heard of these people before? Mahler, maybe I have heard of him.
The hallmark of Mahler's music is that of openness. Unlike Wagner, Mahler invited into his music all the sounds and rhythms and the noisy diversity of the bustling East European communities at Vienna's doorstep, capital of the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire. As an outsider in Vienna, a Jew, a Czech, a poor country boy in a profession full of toffs, it's not surprising that Mahler should identify with the folklore and music of his small-town childhood. In his symphonies, it's possible to identify, for example, the klezmer style of strolling Jewish folk musicians. His music encompasses passing military bands, and he's not afraid to include boisterous children's choruses.
Interesting.
Mahler's symphonies are music's gateway to the 20th century, a musical equivalent of New York's Ellis Island, where Europe's exhausted and oppressed peoples sought refuge and a new start. The musical cultures they'd left behind in Europe found a home in Mahler's generous symphonic embrace. One way we can see a modern perspective emerging in his music is its sense of reality, of truthfulness, warts and all. The frankness of his approach is a major break with the past and is much more characteristic of the 20th than the 19th centuries. How can music be honest? Well, before Mahler, if you were a composer and you wanted to write a piece about loneliness or despair or depression, you'd call it something generic like a nocturne or a sonata pathétique. In an opera, you could have singers act out emotional or political issues, pretending to be someone from another era in a fancy costume. But Mahler stopped all this role-playing. He wanted to evoke the real, contemporary world, with all its actual suffering and joy, without pretense. He told it how it was. Mahler took our worst fears and set them to music. This may seem an unremarkable concept to us, but in 1900 it was shockingly, distressingly new. The unflinching honesty of Mahler's approach is at times unbearable. From 1901, for example, he set to music 5 German poems called Kindertotenlieder, songs on the death of children. The sentiments of the songs are those of a parent's most unspeakable nightmares.
I guess during that time, childhood mortality was a much bigger deal than it is now, and that's why he chose this topic to write about. My first thought was, this is a really weird thing to write about. You know, of all of the human sufferings, this is the one that he chose. But I guess, you know, childhood mortality was much higher back then.
In Mahler's unflinching settings, these distant people of another century suddenly become like us. He's made them real. In a horrible irony, 4 years after he wrote the songs, Mahler's own 5-year-old daughter, Anna Maria, died of scarlet fever. And Mahler himself was diagnosed with a terminal heart condition. When he died in 1911, he was laid to rest in her grave.
Really?
But despite the understandable sadness and alienation we hear in his music, there is incredibly hope of something better, usually associated with childhood and youth, as in his Song of the Earth. The final chord of the Song of the Earth was described by the mid-20th century English composer Benjamin Britten as being imprinted on the atmosphere.
It's like barely there. It's interesting.
But there's something else going on in Mahler's music that wasn't perhaps obvious at the time. It's deceptive. Because of its all-inclusive style, with its borrowings from ethnic folk music, and because of the intensity of feeling he wanted to convey, Mahler's music began to destabilize the centuries-old Western musical system he'd inherited. His pupils in Vienna, led by Arnold Schoenberg, actively wanted to dismantle completely the familiar systems that had underpinned all music for hundreds of years and replace them with a brand new system. This academic rebellion was later labelled serialism or atonality, and it produced decades of scholarly hot air, books, debates and seminars, and in its purest, strictest form, not one piece of music that a normal person could understand or enjoy in 100 years.
I was about to say, like, that's not really enjoyable to listen to. Like, I get it. You're an artist that's trying this experimental thing. But a lot of times when you do that, it just doesn't have the appeal to our ears and to our senses, really. I guess all art is kind of that way, not just music. There are certain things that human beings are drawn to, and when you diverge from that too much, then you're going to have a problem getting people to experience that art. So I can appreciate it from the more academic standpoint, like he's saying right here. It's kind of fun to explore the possibilities, but when it comes to actual like consumable art, then you're going to run into some issues with that.
That's not to say that serialism hasn't always had a cultish following, but for sure these composers weren't courting a mainstream audience.
Fair enough.
Had serialism had any chance of appealing to a paying public, one composer who would surely have opted into it was the musical magpie Richard Strauss, Germany's leading composer after Mahler's death. But he had other, far more mischievous plans up his sleeve. He began his career, conventionally enough, in a musical style that owed much to Liszt and a little to Wagner. Thus Spake Zarathustra is pretty typical, with its now legendary opening Sunrise, made even more famous by Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey.
Oh.
Kubrick uses the power of the piece to underscore a momentous leap forward in the evolution of man.
This is Strauss. Again, it's like you hear it all the time in things, in the media, but you just don't know who actually wrote it. Unless you're already familiar with Strauss. I have seen this movie. A really long time ago.
The power of the idea the film wants to convey, man's discovery of weapons, needs equally portentous music. No one did it better than Strauss. And yet, the ever-versatile Strauss could also write songs of heartbreaking, Mahlerish delicacy, like the song Tomorrow, composed as a wedding present for his wife. On the surface of it, the words of Morgan seem to be optimistic about the future, and tomorrow the sun will shine again. But it's also strangely melancholy. It seems to suggest, in fact, that there will be no tomorrow. It seemed at this point as if Strauss would continue to compose in this wistful but fairly traditional manner. But then he suddenly catapulted himself into musical notoriety with an opera of savage, erotic power that shocked bourgeois society and created a sensation. In one fell swoop, From being the genteel Kapellmeister of the Austrian Belle Epoque, Strauss had transformed himself into the Che Guevara of the musical rebels. The opera in question was Salome, staged in 1905. The opera in question was Salome, staged in 1905. It was immediately banned in several countries, and it gave new meaning to the term discord. Even before Salome herself had stripped off for the Dance of the Seven Veils and scandalized the first night audience. Salome's final passionate solo, addressed to the severed head of John the Baptist, which she then kisses, was the Quentin Tarantino moment.
Oh, jeez. No, stop. Make it stop.
You can either read Salome as a strong, independent young woman who gets what she wants by exploiting her sexuality, cleverly outwitting her stepfather, the king, in the process, or as a kind of demented junkie who lowers humanity's moral standards to rock bottom. Take your pick. Strauss apparently hedges his bets, giving the first mention of the necrophiliac kiss possibly the most dissonant chord ever used in music at that point. It's like the final howl of a busted civilization. But we're not finished with her yet. After asking whether the taste of blood on his lips is actually the taste of love, Salome revisits the kiss in supreme triumph. I have now kissed your mouth, Yohanan, she screams, and Strauss unleashes a musical earthquake which might be construed as a sexual consummation. Again, make up your own mind.
Oh my gosh, stop. Seriously, why are they lingering on this? I can't do severed heads. Like, there's just something about that freaks me out. I don't know what it is, but I can't. Jeez.
King Herod, who had encouraged his stepdaughter to dance in the first place, now ordered his soldiers to kill her. For this climax, Strauss reserved his most discordant and angry music yet.
What happened there?
At this point in musical history, it looked as though the dominance of Austro-German music that began with Bach in 1700 might continue indefinitely. Instead, a new force had emerged and was by the early 20th century the most exhilarating sound in Europe. In the closing decades of the 19th century, the sleeping giant of Russia had awoken. Music was never going to be the same again.
And when it comes to rebellions, Russia is in a class of its own.
Here's Tchaikovsky. One of you was wanting Tchaikovsky in this episode.
For all of the 18th and most of the 19th centuries, Russia doggedly copied the culture of Western Europe, which the Russian court deemed more sophisticated and interesting than anything homegrown.
Even Russia's most famous composer of them all, Tchaikovsky, who became a worldwide star in the 1880s and 90s, was still composing in a style that owed more to Beethoven or Brahms than to anything he'd picked up on the banks of the Volga. But there was something Tchaikovsky excelled at that was distinctly Russian and that contained within it the seeds of a coming revolution: dance.
I love the Nutcracker.
If, for Italians, the supreme expression of their love of music was the emotionally charged operatic aria, for Russians it was dance. And Tchaikovsky wrote some of the most celebrated and memorable dance music of all time.
I haven't seen Swan Lake, but I heard this music before. See, I can watch this. Opera's different, but I can watch this.
The result of this flowering of dance is that the need for a driving rhythm began to change the character of the music itself, making it more robust, muscular and exciting. Russian music was about to explode into a life in a manner that was unprecedented and subsequently unmatched in history.
In Russia, the invigorating, regulated beat of dance is everywhere. At the ballet, in operas, on the concert stage, lilting, driving, whirling, tiptoeing, leaping, gliding, jumping, gyrating and twirling. Russian music can't get enough of it. Presumably, it's the cold. You have to keep moving or your circulation will pack in.
The rhythms of dance first powered this Russian awakening. The second vital element, which changed the melody and harmony, came from a renewed interest in Russia's own religious heritage. A new breed of composers, starting in the 1880s, turned their attention not to the musical traditions of Western Europe, but to those of their own, especially the centuries-old Russian Orthodox chants with their deep basses and thick 8 or 16 voice block chords.
I have to say, I had no idea that religion was such a big thing in Russia. In our previous the Napoleon videos, we did talk about how the Russian troops would gather and have like a religious service kind of before going into battle, and they would have the priests pray and all of this stuff, and we're seeing this here with the music. I don't know, like, I think, you know, here in the United States we're taught to have just like such a hardcore view of Russia, and this softer like religious side was really, I was just oblivious to it, honestly. I think in the past I have heard references to, you know, like Christianity and religion, you know, being a thing in Russia, but it wasn't until I started watching these videos on Napoleon and I guess now too, where it's really kind of like I've absorbed it and kind of understand it a little bit more. It's interesting.
In the decades to follow, this ancient sound, known as Znameny chant, was to flow like a river into the choral texture of all Russian composers. No longer did they look west for inspiration.
The fuse lighter of the Russian firework display about to unfold, the truly original creative pathfinder, wasn't cosmopolitan, well-travelled friend of the Romanovs Tchaikovsky, but a former military cadet who worked in the civil service and had a fatal vodka habit, Modest Mussorgsky.
Mussorgsky is quite simply the most original composer of the late 19th century, a one-off, whose ideas were new, not derived from other composers of his time.
I've never heard of him.
There's a reason for this. Mussorgsky wasn't musically trained at a conservatoire, and he wasn't a professional composer. He was self-taught and therefore blissfully unaware of the rules he was breaking. It was like he'd wandered on to Tsarist Russia's Got Talent, slightly drunk, and started improvising at the piano, to everyone's amazement.
Interesting thing to write about, pictures at an
But despite
exhibition.
the naivety of his style, which earned him more than a little ridicule at the time, Mussorgsky showed that Russian music could carve its own identity.
It's got an interesting sound to it.
To see how radically the music of Russia had changed in fewer than 40 years, listen to this coronation scene from A Life for the Tsar, an opera written by the Russian composer Mikhail Glinka in 1836. Glinka had his musical training in Italy, Austria and Germany, and it shows. Now listen to another Kremlin coronation scene from the thoroughly Russian opera by Mussorgsky, Boris Godunov. This time, complete with colours, voices and glittering effects, tolling bells and echoing orchestra chimes, it's been thoroughly Russianized.
Definitely has a distinct sound to
Mussorgsky
it.
died in 1881, his music virtually unknown outside of Russia, but that was about to change. So many of the seeds of the rebellions of late 19th century music can be traced to one extraordinarily fertile event. It took place in Paris in 1889, the centenary of the French Revolution. It was the World's Fair.
Was this the first one?
Here, in the Trocadero, which overlooked the newly built Eiffel Tower, Widor first played his famous organ toccata. And here also non-Russian composers heard the music of Mussorgsky for the first time. One such composer, then aged 27, was Claude Debussy. His visit to the World's Fair was a life and music-changing experience.
What Debussy learnt from Mussorgsky was that there was a way of building up the architecture of a piece of music that was an alternative to the developmental method that was bread and butter to Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven. The development approach was to take small cells of melody or rhythm, or both, and make up a whole discourse from them over a 15 or 20-minute period. So Beethoven is able to construct a whole symphony movement from this tiny idea. Count how many times he uses it in just the first 40 bars of the symphony. That's 13.
Wish I could just sit down at a piano and play this.
That's already 33 and counting.
Alright, we're gonna stop it there. I know that it was kind of an awkward spot, but I wanted to stop it before we got too far into Debussy because we were kind of at the halfway point here. So we're gonna wrap it up here for part 1. We'll pick it up at this point for part 2. I might go back just a little bit to have a little bit of a recap. But yeah, I would love to just be able to sit down at the piano and just start playing any random old classical piece like that. That would be great. Out of all of the composers that we kind of went through in this episode, Tchaikovsky was my absolute favorite. I love the Nutcracker. I grew up with a CD of the Nutcracker and I would listen to it a lot. And I actually played was it called Trepak? I used to play that on handbells at church. We would play that at Christmas time. That was really fun to play in handbells because it was really fast and there's a lot going on. So far, liking this era a little bit better than our previous era of tragedy with Wagner and Liszt, that's for sure. I will say the music is slightly more on the mellow side for me. I do prefer the more very catchy melodic tunes of like Mozart and Beethoven. This stuff, it would be fun to listen to like when you want something a little bit more relaxing, I guess, to listen to. I don't necessarily dislike it. It's just that after a little while, especially on those like Mahler pieces and oh shoot, I forgot the composer he was talking about prior to that, but those like softer, calmer piano pieces that we were listening to, for me personally, I get a little bored listening to that. I need something a little bit more interesting to keep my ear engaged, but I know not everybody's like that. A lot of people really love that type of music. I think that's why I like Tchaikovsky a lot, is because it was, like he said here, very rhythmic, which was something that was kind of new to classical music. Alright, so I hope that you enjoyed this little glimpse at late 19th century music. I'm sure we're going to be getting into the 20th century. I'm really looking forward to that actually, and kind of seeing the even, you know, I think bigger transformation from what we've heard in the past. I think we're also going to see music from the New World, from America, kind of come into play with some of that. But if you enjoyed this video, make sure that you like and subscribe. We're going to have the part 2 to this next Sunday for Music Sundays. I also have some social media if you would like to follow me there and get a little behind the scenes look at things. On Facebook, I have both a page and a group, and the group is the more active one, so you might want to go into Facebook groups and just search for SoGal and you'll find me there. It is a private group. You have to answer a little question: who is my sidekick over here? Answer is Roger. Just in case you didn't know, even though he's Beethoven right now. So anyway, I hope you will join me again next Sunday for part 2, and stay tuned for a lot more history and culture, and we're just going to be doing all kinds of stuff on this channel. There's a lot to get to, and it's kind of exhausting thinking about it, but it's also going to be fun. So I hope you stick around. Beethoven here, and I will see you next time.